Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is part 2. We're going to finish up the fragmentation topic, and then we're going to jump into bytes in flight. And then if there's time available, there's a bonus topic. Less than 50-50 chance it'll fit, but we'll see where we land. So during the break, Sean, behind you, Chris, and then Sean. Yes. So Sean came up with a great point that I should have mentioned around the large send offload. If you suspect it's creating problems, just ask the admins to turn it off, right? It's a fairly simple thing to turn on and off. I'm pretty sure you don't have to reboot. I don't know if it affects anything that's in flight already, but you could schedule time for it to be turned off. And then see if the thing that you're troubleshooting goes away, right? Did I say that? Yeah, okay, thank you for that. All right, was there something else we were going to bring up? I know it was that.
Well, the fact that you probably shouldn't, unless you have to, you shouldn't troubleshoot on a client or a server, but tap out.
Okay, yeah, so that was another good point. So we're looking at host-based capture. So we're seeing things as they leave and arrive at a host. If you have a tap feeding a capture appliance or even feeding a laptop running Wireshark, right, you're going to see what's actually on the wire. So you'll see the real thing. Now, depending on how far away that tap is from the two players, you have to interpret the latency a little bit different. But if you're close, right? So host-based captures, one set of possible behaviors. Tap-based or span-based captures would be what's really on the wire. Okay. All right, so we're going to finish fragmentation. We're going to jump bytes in flight. That's a big topic. We're going to be there for a while, and then again, a bonus if possible. So let's get started. This is where we were when we took our break. Hopefully everybody got some refreshments, coffee, tea, walk around a little bit. So this is where we were at the end of our break. Our question was, we have to examine what comes next. We have Wireshark telling us that the previous segment was not captured. We don't know yet if that means it's out of sequence or if it literally got dropped completely. So that's why we've got to examine what comes next. So a couple of things, if we go down our decode summary, a couple of things to note. So we've received 2 more packets. We've received this one and this one, and yet we still don't have our missing segment. So things were in flight, they're coming from the sender, they're starting to show up at the receiver. Remember, there's 112 milliseconds round trip, so 60 milliseconds ago things were happening. So far our missing segment has not shown up, so we're kind of wondering, maybe this is not out of sequence. And we'll just kind of recap again in pictures the segmentation that we're dealing with. So on the server side capture, we sent 2 big streams, one of them 2569, the other one was 3876. This comes from server side. On the client side, they're smaller pieces. I'm going to combine those together so we can look at them side by side. So this is this is not 100% pixel precise in terms of where things line up, but it's an approximation. So I wonder if I point at this screen. Oh, look at that, it does work. Okay, so this left edge, these are the same segments. This is the same stream bytes shown in picture form. So we received, you can see we received this 1292, there's something missing, and then we received these other 2 bytes. Interestingly enough, notice the number of bytes missing is 1277. Now somebody had a question during the break about push bit. Was that Kevin? Kevin, yeah. So Kevin had a question about the push bit. Would the NIC card, if you're doing large send offload, would the NIC card honor the push bit? And I said, I don't know, it depends on the driver, in my opinion, right? That could be something snarky. But I think the fact that we're missing 1277 and we see 1292, at least in these three segments, TCP lengthwise, suggests something, the NIC card did something special with that segment. So let's continue to fill in the blanks here. So we have some other clues about our stream here. So notice we're really kind of focused in 5 to 10 packet time range, examining some pretty detailed, examining a lot of details. So we know from next sequence number that we should be expecting 522835. Instead, oh, by the way, that is the one that got retransmitted. And just to be sure of that, we're going to jump back to this slide from part 1 and see that, yes, 521.543 was the one, and 522835 is the segment that got retransmitted. Back to part 2 again. There's some other clues here about packet loss, and notice the change in the ACK behavior. So previously, the client was ACKing every second packet, which is the normal expected behavior. But now, if you notice, it's actually starting to ACK every packet. As soon as it got this one, now this ACK, you could say, okay, it's because I received 2 of them, but this is actually not what we were expecting in terms of sequence numbers. We wanted 835, we got something different. So we ACK it, we got something else, and notice we immediately ACK that. So we're still out of order, meaning what's coming from the sender is still out of order. So the question is, why is it doing that? And the answer is, because that's normal behavior for the receiver, right? If I get something, if I receive a segment out of order, I have to immediately ACK it. Does everybody agree with that? Right? We got one absolutely definite, without a doubt, yes. Anybody on the fence on that one? So this is one of the things about TCP you want to feel really good about. The delayed ACK behavior, how a receiver handles out of sequence packets and segments arriving out of order. So it has to ACK every packet until it gets the one it wants. So notice when we send this ACK packet, notice it said Wireshark has added some expert info here. I'm going to just point here. This will be easier. Wireshark has added some expert info. TCP dupe for ACK 1002. It's duplicate ACK number 1, which means it's the second ACK. Right? We had the original one, and now this is the first dupe ACK. So I want to use the power of the profile to flip the view a little bit so that we can look at the SAC fields, because there's SAC fields included. If you remember, for this connection we negotiated SAC. So let's take a look at the SAC fields. So this profile, I just went down to the bottom right-hand menu, picked a new profile called SBSAC, and now we have 2 additional new columns: SAC left edge and SAC right edge. And you want to challenge yourself to be comfortable with this concept of left edge, right edge, because it has to do with orientation of the actual segments. So notice that the client is saying, hey, I'm still missing 522835, but look at this, I am receiving additional segments. So the first one, this left edge, notice that we've got 52404, but notice it goes up. So notice how the right edge keeps, I'm moving to my right because I'm right-handed. Notice the right edge keeps moving out to indicate, hey, I've got this gap, but I'm continuing to receive segments that are in order, but I still have this gap over here. So we can see the client saying, hey, I'm missing this data. The part I wanted to focus on is here is you're looking at this client capture, and you've seen the client is saying, I'm missing something. And yet, if you look closely at the capture, the server keeps sending more data out of order. And you kind of stop for a minute and say, why in the world is it doing that? I've already told it I'm missing something. Why does it continue to send out of order?
Large offload, transmit offload, the NIC is not handling the duplicate acts, etc. That has to get up into the stack.
So, I know your name. Tell me again. Richard?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Richard's, for those who might not have heard Richard, you're saying, okay, on the sender side, the sender NIC is not handling these duplicate acts. It has to get up to the TCP stack, and the TCP stack on the sender will handle it. And that's sort of the answer, part of the answer I was looking for, but the other part was time, right? Because all these things are in flight, right, and they're showing up, and that because the round trip is 112, let's call it an even 55 milliseconds in each direction. So hopefully the sender is filling up the pipe, and you've got all this traffic coming towards the client. Uh-oh, there's a piece missing. They still are in flight except for that one piece. So we're signaling back that, I continue to get this data from you, but I still would really like the piece I'm missing. So we're going to look at this from a visual standpoint. Now, I'm a visual person. I'll just share with you quickly. My wife of 37 years is not a visual person. When I need to explain something complex and I say, let me draw you a picture, she goes, stop. I don't want to see a picture. I don't do well with pictures. So hopefully if you're a visual audience, some of this will make sense, especially when you see the dimension of time. So now what we're looking at, if you could imagine, we're looking at both endpoints at the same time. And we see what's happening at any given point in time on both ends. So we have, we've highlighted one of these red segments here. So the red segment with no arrow means one or more packets. I'm sorry, 2 or more packets. If it was only one packet, it would have an arrow. So we've highlighted this rightmost red line, which then shows up down here in the bottom in the decodes. So whatever's in that red line, we're now exposing the decode summary in the bottom pane so we can see what's in there. And let's see, rightmost bar selected. So this is what we want to focus on for our current discussion. We're going to use our stopwatch again to kind of pay attention to what's happening at both ends. So zooming in a little bit, notice that there was, on the left, a fairly thick blue line. It's thicker than the others, right? Which tells me there's more packets in it. So that blue line was received at the client, that's the top of the swim lane, and as soon as they were received, there were acts being sent. So if you think about, if you're the client, a couple of packets come in, you don't know what else is coming, you just know what has come in, and you start to act them like you normally would. And then there's another blue line here, where there's acts coming off of that. And then notice there's an ACK off of this blue one and then off of this blue one. So visually we can see, if we were looking at the decodes in Wireshark, we would see packets coming in, ACKs going out, packets coming in, ACKs going out. The value of the visual is when you come back to this view, now you kind of see again what's happening at both ends. So packets arrived, ACKs were sent, and let's zoom in to here a little bit. Notice that this ACK came in, and immediately more payload was sent. Does that make sense, color visual-wise? We've got ACKs coming in. The blue indicates large segments going out. We've got more ACKs coming in, payload goes out. More ACKs coming in, and then no payload. We've stopped sending. So at this point in time, we've learned I can't send more data because you're missing something. There's something that's still missing, and I've got to wait for that third duplicate ACK to show up. So now we're moving again in time, and if I think there's a zoom in here. Did I zoom in? Yeah. So this red one coming down here, notice there's a blue line right after it. That's our third, it's our fourth, it's our triple duplicate ACK telling the server, here's what I'm missing. And if you notice how the blue line is labeled, it's labeled as a retransmission. You can't, if you moused over it, it would tell you which packet you're retransmitting. So we've got the missing segment, so the missing segment goes up to the client, the ACK comes back, and then we're finally able to start back on our journey. Everything's put back together, feeding it up to the app layer, and now we're ready to keep going. So part of this series was just thinking about, okay, why is the sender continuing to send? And it's because he hasn't learned yet. He hasn't got the fourth ACK, right? He's got the original dupe 1, dupe 2, but not dupe 3 down at this area down here. He doesn't know yet that there's trouble in River City. But when we get here, this ACK is the one that tells him. So when you're looking at a list of packets from one side, you can't get a perspective of the big picture. So there's our retransmission. I think there's one more question here. Let's look at a few more details. Anybody use the delta to the previous time? So that's usually really valuable, right? But sometimes you have to adjust the timing a little bit. I want to talk about that. So we're showing that our missing packet finally arrived. Here it is, 522835. It finally arrived, and it arrived 107 milliseconds after the previous packet. And the reason I call that out is because we know that the round trip time is like 121, 129. If you think back to when we did our original comparison, it's like, well, how did that get here faster when we know the round trip time is higher? So I wanted to zoom on that for a minute to bring up another Wireshark feature, because if you think about it, there's a whole parade of Wireshark features. We have more than one developer in here. We love you guys, by the way. We love the core developers. So one of the features I want to call out is this set and unset time reference. Do you guys, anybody use that? Super valuable. Man, a lot of hands went up. A lot of hands went up. Next year, I'm going to ask, okay, since last year, who has seen The Sixth Sense or Young Frankenstein? I expect to see hands going up, just so you know. Okay, set, unset, time reference, super easy to use. Highlight the row you want, right mouse click, select it, or Control T. And now you can see the reference has changed, and I purposely changed it to the third duplicate ACK, right? So that's the fourth total ACK. Because I wanted to see what's the time delta from when I told the server, hey, I'm missing something. What's the time delta from when I actually received it, which is down here at the bottom. And notice it's 100, sorry, I got to steady my hand. 116 milliseconds, which sort of tracks with what we're expecting round trip latency to be. If it was 107, that would be like not enough, something's not right. Or something has changed in the path, which would just be additional information. So time reference, super useful. A couple more things to examine about this. So our retransmitted packet says, hey, this is out of order. And so my question is, would retransmit or fast retransmit be more accurate / useful? And that's just a question. I'm not saying it's a bad thing or a good thing. It's just like, hey, it's actually a retransmission. It's not just out of order. It is actually a retransmission. and it is sort of tied to the triple duplicate ACK. So, two more things before we finish this segment. Remember in our picture where we were resending a smidgen more segment than what was missing out of that first segment? Just a tiny bit. I don't have that picture handy, unfortunately. But when we receive the missing segment here, and we said, hey, that's out of order, notice the client is sending, some SAC information. It's like, hey, oh, by the way, I also received some things I was not expecting. I've already received 112 through 127. So just letting you know, Mr. Sender, I already had these bytes. It's just information. So that's basically what that SAC is. Hey, I've already received these 15 bytes, just letting you know, not exactly sure why you sent them to me again, but it's okay because you're allowed to do that by the RFC. Although I should read about the push bit. If it's already been pushed, I don't know if it's a good idea to resend it or not. So moving down, one more packet. We received our missing data, we acted with SAC, and now we've received some more payload. What did we get? We got another 1292. And notice the delta time now is 119. So we've seen, in our handshake, we've seen 121, 129, we just saw 117, now we're seeing 119. What is this time delta? What does that suggest about the bytes in flight and the congestion window when that was received? Just thinking out loud. So to answer that, it helps with a picture, at least for visual people. Okay. So here's the packet in question is right here, right? And the question is, why was there one round trip time delay? And what does that suggest about the congestion window? Well, when we resent this missing packet, we had to wait for an ACK. And notice back here, we talked about the fact that there's an ACK. Sorry for the unsteady hand here. Let's try this again. Back here. Normally there would be a red and a blue, a red and a blue, a red and a blue. ACK, send more payload, ACK, send more payload. Because down in the bottom is the sender, up at the top is the client. So what this suggests is that we can't have any more data outstanding because the network is not reliable. So because this packet was missing and I had to resend it, I'm not going to send any more fresh data until we resolve that situation. In other words, the congestion window closed. And everybody should be familiar with the TCP congestion window. I'm seeing heads nodding. Not many, but a couple. I know Chris knows. So anyway, the question about why did it take 119 milliseconds is because it was a round trip. We got the missing data up here, then we had to ACK it, and then we were able to send data, and that's one round trip. Is everybody comfortable with that concept of a round trip? You can see it visually on the graph. It's kind of hard to see in the numbers if you're looking at a packet list. You can see time deltas, but it doesn't necessarily catch your eye. If you see a picture, it'll definitely catch your eye. Okay, so we're done with fragment overlap. We also examine frame sizes and how they can be different on the sender versus the receiver. We also looked at some display time deltas being unique to each time, each endpoint rather. So we're done now with the fifth comparison, and we're about to move into bytes in flight. So we've kind of started simple. We did the sends, we did latency. What did we do after latency? I forgot. Whatever we did, it was simple, right? And it's been getting more and more complex. So now that we're going into bytes in flight, this is where it gets the most complex. So is there anything new that we've looked at so far that's helpful or interesting to you? Anybody want to volunteer a comment? Do the visualizations help? Kind of getting that view of, hey, what I can't see in a list of packets, I can see with a picture. Anybody like the visualization? Got a bunch of hands? Okay, any other comments before we go on? Okay. All right, we're going to go into bytes in flight. So let's start with a review. What is the meaning of bytes in flight, which is a Wireshark term? Anybody? We need a volunteer. I know Chris knows.
Number of bytes out without an ACK.
Without an ACK. So the number of bytes transmitted without an ACK. That's a very important metric because it gives us a window into what the congestion window might be. Well, actually what it is, right? Fair enough, right? So it's very important. How is this metric related to performance? Performance being speed and response time and throughput.
Bigger number of bytes in flights, you have bigger throughput.
Throughput, so I can burst more. If that bytes in flight value is high, meaning the congestion window is high, I may be able to burst more and keep the pipe busy. So higher throughput, faster transfers, etc. So, as you might expect, you're going to see that bytes in flight for the sender and receiver captures look very different, and we're going to compare a few packet exchanges to understand this better. So I was trying to think about an analogy for bytes in flight, and I came up with a dry cleaning conveyor belt. Have you been to a dry cleaners and they've got the conveyor belt with your jacket moving around the whole store? Have you ever seen? And it goes up in the ceiling and then it comes back down again. Anybody not seen that? It's kind of, it looks something like this. This is actually an advanced model. If you notice, it has two rows. Imagine sending two packets at once. So it has two rows, a top row and a bottom row. And what I thought was also interesting in terms of an analogy is this top view where you're looking down from the top and you're kind of seeing that, okay, I send things in one direction and then I maybe ricochet back and send something in the other direction. Sort of similar, sort of an analogy to bytes in flight. I wish I had a better one. Can anyone think of a good analogy of bytes in flight? Like filling up the pipe, something that's not network related?
What I use is if I'm moving a swimming pool's worth of water to another
Oh, there you go.
empty and,
Yeah.
and my pipe is only a hose, or it could be a huge sewer pipe, depends on
Okay.
depends on the size of the pipe, but then the congestion window has to be able to fill that.
Right, so you might start sending one bucket over, pour it in, then get two buckets and pour it in, then go back and get four buckets and pour it. Okay, we're going to see some of that coming up here. Not the buckets, of course. Okay, so where do you find the bytes in flight decode? So it's part of the TCP header. It's a calculated value in Wireshark. It doesn't exist in the packets. So, and you know, I think by now everybody knows anytime you see things in brackets, those are Wireshark calculated values, extremely valuable. I can't think of a single bracketed value that doesn't have use. I mean, they're really super useful. Bytes in flight being one of them. And of course, you can right mouse click on that field and add it as a column, and it automatically updates your profile. It's wonderful stuff. So here we're going to look at the server side now, and we're going to kind of focus on the bytes in flight metric and notice a couple of things about it. So notice that, and by the way, I picked a point in time where the congestion window was empty, just so we see a starting point. So notice we sent, let's call it 3K, rough numbers, and bytes in flight is now 3K. There was some hacking from the client, And then we sent more data. We sent 5K, even though we know this didn't really go across the network. This is what we're able to see from the capture. So that's all we've got to work with. So we then increment that number. Well, first we decrease it by the ACK. We increment it by the new length, decrease it by this ACK, increase it, decrease it, increase it. It's a constant moving target. And you'll see it gets bigger, 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 and then it gets smaller. Now, why did it get smaller between these two? Which might be hard to see from the back. But notice there's two ACKs here. So the client is actually acknowledging more data between the sends. But let's look at a picture, because I'm a visual guy. So let's start with that first segment that we looked at, which was that sequence number 1761 for a length of 3876, just conveniently for my convenience. And so the bytes in flight is 3876. We just saw that in the summary. And then there was an ACK. And the ACK said ACKing 4345. Great. And what does that mean? It means I've received everything up until 4344, including 4344, and I'm ready for 4345. So this picture kind of gives you a sense, and again, this is from the perspective of the sender. I sent this big segment, I just got back an ACK. Now, bytes in flight needs to be adjusted because this receiver has told me he's received some data. It's no longer in flight. So the value at that point would be 1292. We've seen that number multiple times, haven't we? 1292. It's sort of a, for this capture and this connection, it's a repeating number. So then what do? We send another segment. So the yellow is bytes in flight, green has been acknowledged, so we've got a portion of the original segment in flight plus a brand new segment. And now bytes in flight goes up to 6460. I've got two more examples, but I'll stop here. Does this visual talk to you? Does it help? What is bytes in flight? Okay. So now we receive another ACK. Do I have that on the screen? Yeah, down here, 6929. And notice that fills in a little bit of this one and a portion of this one. And now our bytes in flight is back to 3876. So you can think of bytes in flight in this fashion. You're pushing data bytes out, you're getting ACKs. This is where that right edge, left edge comes in. I'm going to turn my back to you guys just for a minute. My left edge, my right edge. As data is being received, the right edge moves out. As it's being ACKed, the left edge moves that way as well. Kind of like what we see in the picture, right? If this is the new left edge, that's the new right edge. We get an ACK. This is the new left edge of outstanding, and this is it's the same right edge. So left edge, right edge, it's an important concept. If you read the RFC, it talks about left edge, right edge. Not my favorite reading, but it's useful. Okay, we talked about decreasing. Why did that happen? Because there were two ACKs received, which further decremented before we did our transmit. Looking at the timing, we get a little bit of another idea of round trip time. And the reason I'm talking about round trip time is because latency, round trip time, and congestion are related. We're not going to have time to go into congestion today, unfortunately. But if you're aware of how to interpret when you see something like this, where you've sent one segment, and then 116 milliseconds later you get back your first acknowledgement, you can kind of guess round trip time is 116 milliseconds, regardless of what you saw in the SYN. Remember what we saw in the SYN, 121? Well, there must have been some congestion in the network at that specific moment in time, because we're now seeing a number that's less than that. In fact, your lowest round trip time you could consider to be the true latency, if that makes sense. I was talking at lunchtime with somebody from Swedish police whose cars drive around. Latency would have no meaning for them because they're always in motion, right? Probably on a 3G network, 4G network, yeah. Yeah, so as long as your users are stationary, latency, you can think about it. If they're moving around, forget it. So if you're doing 5G networking, whatever. Okay, let's jump to the receiver. So now we're on the client side, and notice that, as expected, because we already examined this, the packet sizes are smaller, 1292. Again, something special for this connection. We see bytes in flight. Hey, I just got data. I just acted all. Bytes in flight is 0. I just got some more data. I act all of it. Bytes in flight is 0. And that repeats. Got data, acted all. Bytes in flight goes to 0. Does that make sense? If I act every other packet on the client, which is what I'm supposed to do, bytes in flight will never get bigger than 2 segments. So you can't really use bytes in flight on the client side or the receiver side thinking about file transfer. It doesn't really have any meaning. Does that make sense? It has meaning on the sender side. So that almost suggests whenever you can get a capture on the client, on the server, or close to the server off of an appliance or a tap, you're going to be in a better position to understand the congestion window. You could almost say you'll never understand it from the standpoint of the client because of the ACK behavior. And that's kind of a key point to walk out of here with. Does everybody agree with that? Feel comfortable with that? All right, it's a great indicator of performance, but it's really only relevant when you look at it from the sender capture. And if you can't get it from the sender, if you can get it close to the sender off a tap, that's better than nothing, right? If you know you're close. So what else can we learn from bytes in flight? So far, we've seen we talked about it can inform us about network health and congestion. We said it's a performance indicator, but we can also get a sense, and I put that in quotes. We can get a sense of send buffer sizing and how the application is using the TCP API, either blocking or non-blocking. You can get a sense of it, in quotes. It'll never be exact from the traffic, but at least we could be informed enough that we might decide, I'm going to go talk to the developer and say, hey, you're only using 16K buffers. That's why this thing is slow. You need to increase your send buffers. And we'll look at that next. So let's look at how we can infer send buffer size. So we're going to look at bytes in flight. We're going to look at how the send buffer size might actually be limiting congestion window. But before we answer the question at the bottom, what are the things that impact the TCP congestion window? And these are not in any particular order. So audience, please. What can impact the congestion window?
Packet loss.
Packet loss can cause it to shrink. Anything else?
Out of order.
Say it again.
Out of order.
Well, that's kind of like out of order might trigger the same congestion algorithms for packet loss. So yes. Okay. Anything else?
Round trip time. Cheaper.
Round trip time, I don't know. Maybe if the timestamp is there, that might have an influence. I don't know that for sure. How about, there's one I'm not hearing that is a basic one. This is like TCP 101.
Retracement time on latency.
Nope. Okay, how about receive window? I can never transmit more than what the receiver tells me he can accept in the receive window size. And we're going to look at a graphic of that in just a second. So, in my preference of order, receive window is the first thing that throttles it. Second is network health. And third is send buffers. And I don't know why I'm thinking of something else. But those are the top three, and we're going to look at a graphic in just a second. How can we find the max, using Wireshark, how can we find the maximum bytes in flight from the sender side? Like if I have my whole capture and I'm looking at it, how can I find the biggest value of bytes in flight? Sort by that column, yes. Okay, good. All right. So I want to show you a picture that might be helpful or it might be confusing. But let's see if we can. So we've got a concept of a congestion control window in blue. It's a concept, meaning you can't really measure it directly from the network traffic. We can only infer what the value is. We've got receive buffer in red. You can see the red line going across here. What would you call that value? 32K?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's assume that the receive window size reported by the receiver is 32K pretty much constantly. And then we're measuring bytes in flight by looking at the traffic from the sender. So far, so good? So we start out, it looks like we've sent some packets and then we stopped. Why did we stop?
It's fast start.
Slow start.
Slow start.
Slow start, right? So then the congestion window opens a little bit more because we were successful. Now we send some more data, bytes in flight. We stop. Congestion window opens, we're able to send more data. We send that data, congestion window opens, now we're able to send even more. And notice it's doubling. It's sort of, I don't know if this is actual doubling on this graphic, but the intent is it's doubling each time. Okay, then we continue to go up, and then even though congestion window continues to be happy and healthy and going bigger, I can never go bigger than the receive window size. Does that make sense in this picture? So we've got in-flight data, which we can monitor, we can measure. We've got receive window that we can see in the traffic. And then we've got the congestion window. So let's move the receive window higher. So let's assume that the receive window is now, let's call that 58K, just in round numbers. So the receiver is saying, hey, I've got room for 58K, thank you very much. We can see the blue line is going up, is going up, it's going up. But bytes in flight stalls here. So the question is, why would it stall? What's holding us back? And the answer is send buffers. Because the application said, allocate memory, let's call it, in this case, 32K. Allocate 32K of memory, fill up those buffers and send them, right? Now send another 32K. Now send another 32K. Or when a segment comes back, send a new segment. But never get bigger than 32K because that's all that's been allocated when the developer said, I'm going to allocate my send buffers.
So that socket buffer size is going to send socket size.
Send socket size, thank you. Right, so that's that expression of when I'm going to open the socket, I have to say how many buffers do I want to use for sending. And then also, I imagine receive is another parameter. I've never coded to the TCP stack, so this is kind of anecdotal based on talking to other people. But this is not anecdotal. We're working with a customer right now who's transmitting from Phoenix to Hong Kong, and the receive window is 1.2 meg, and they're not getting more than a significant amount less in flight data, as measured from the sender. So this graphic could help you when you're thinking about, well, what would throttle when? And again, the network is healthy. There's no retransmissions, there's no out of sequence, there's no packet loss. Then what's holding back in-flight has to be the send buffers. So bytes in flight gives you some insight. Did I go backwards or forwards? Okay. So the magic answer you guys gave me was sort by bytes in flight column. So this is the server side capture. Bytes in flight is in here. We've sorted, and the biggest number we can find is 23K in our capture. So I've moved 16 meg across the network. The biggest number we can find is 23K, meaning I've never gone above that. Something is throttling it from keeping it to go bigger than. Now this particular capture we know has packet loss. The actual issues in New York, they undersized the link horribly. It sucks, it's terrible, it's a New York issue. But regardless, that's the way you can find out, well, what is the maximum bytes in flight? And now you can have a discussion, assuming the network is healthy, you can have a discussion with the application team, or it's a little harder, but also with a third-party product vendor. Because a lot of times the issues in third-party products, like replication software, backup software, other kind of batch processing, MQ messaging, JMS messaging software. Your company doesn't control it, but your company pays for support. So you're in a position to say, hey, third-party vendor, you need to fix this because it's impacting our performance, it's impacting production. So again, assuming the network is healthy, the congestion window is happy, receive window is higher than BIF. So this is what we've been talking about. There's 50% of the people I work with that tell me, John, you're too detail-oriented. You notice too much stuff. But there's another 50% that say, John, you don't notice enough. You're not paying attention. So I'm in that middle. We saw something odd in the previous screen that I didn't call out, but I do want to call it out now. It doesn't have to do with send buffers. It doesn't have to do with BIF. It's something a little bit different. So let's call it out. When we sorted our list by bytes in flight, just coincidentally, the color scheme, the default color scheme was back. I don't remember how I did that, but I probably pressed the button up there. And we're looking at the server capture. Now, what's a little bit weird here is there's a lot of out-of-order packets that came from the server. So this is the server IP, by the way. And Wireshark is saying, hey, you sent these segments and you sent them out of order. How is that possible? How does that happen? More questions. Remember my favorite book? Anybody remember the title? Wisdom Without Answers. So another question we have here is like, well, damn, how can the server, and by the way, these were called out in the expert info that we looked at. There was some on the server side. So we've got to do a little bit of a quick detour. We're going to jump into out-of-sequence packets because we noticed something. We finished with our discussion about bytes in flight and send buffers. And we noticed something odd. They at work, they kind of call me the king of corner cases because I find weird stuff, you know. It just, I don't know, it's a double-edged sword. It's a gift and it's a curse. So let's go look at out of sequence for a minute just to make sure that you guys are looking at the heuristics with a sharp eye. So how can sender segments be out of order? Is this even possible? You wouldn't think so. If the sender is sending, I should be sending things in order, right? Wouldn't you expect that? If I'm dealing the cards, I have to deal them in the right order. So why would this happen? So we're going to resort our list of packets and we're going to have another look. Again, we've got colors. So we've resorted now by frame number. And apologies for the colors, it's really hard on the eyes. And you can see over here, we've got dupacks, we've got a fast retransmission, dupack, out of order, dupack, out of order, dupack, dupack, out of order, dupack. Do you see a pattern? I was going to try to focus on some specific packets and sequence numbers, but honestly, I don't think my brain could handle it at this point in the day. The key point is what we're going to talk about next. So there's a few things pointed out. Yeah, we got dupacks. We did a fast retransmission, which is good, right? We want to see a fast retransmission after 3 dupacks, don't we? Ideally, if fast retransmission is on. And then we did the fast retransmission. Oh, that was fast. But we've got all of these out of orders. It's like, what the heck? All right, so if we go back to our help screen, and I want to ask you to think about interpreting the state of things versus decoding. Decoding is pretty simple. I'm going to say simple. It's not simple, but decoding is a simpler task. You know, map field names to certain byte offsets and you make it easy to read. Decoding is fairly simple. I'm not minimizing it. It's hard work. But when you compare it to interpreting the state of a connection or a segment or what's being retransmitted or figuring out, should I label it fast retransmission or should I label it out of sequence, there's a bit of rocket science in there. So from the help manual from Wireshark, if you go to help and you say, help me understand what out of order means, there's 5 conditions that all have to be true, and when they are true, we're going to label it out of order. Whether it's out of order or not, if it matches these conditions, we're going to label it out of order. And by the way, in this case, out of order supersedes. I don't know how well known that word means. Supersedes. Is there another word that would be better than supersedes? Overcomes, more prevalent, more powerful. Wins when there's a tie. I don't know. Obsoletes, yeah. Meaning if this condition is true, if we thought it was a retransmission, we're going to change that label to out of order because these 5 things are true. It's kind of like when you're playing poker, 3 of a kind beats 2 of a kind. Makes sense, hopefully. Honestly, my brain is too mushed right now to go into details, but I did kind of notice this one here. The last segment arrived within the calculated RTT 3 milliseconds by default. So arrival has more to do with the receiver than the sender. We're looking at the sender. Agreed? We saw we were on the sender's capture. So it's got to have something to do with the next expected sequence number as compared to something. So these 5 conditions are the reason why they're called out of order, even though they're not really out of order. So here's why this is important. Expert info, you open it up, you say, look at all this great stuff, I need to go research it. All right? If I use the word heuristics, I think that is appropriate. There's heuristics at play, basically rule sets, right? Combinations of conditions that result in a label. Aha, it's an out of order. They're generally pretty good, but they're not perfect because there's always corner cases, and there's corner cases inside of corner cases. So you have to take them with a grain of salt. So if you relied solely on expert info, you might incorrectly conclude the network is messing with packet order more than it really is. It is messing with packet order, but not to the extent that expert info would have you believe. So my only point, I'm not hopefully not slamming anybody, my intent is not, it's just you need to be able to interpret. There's human interpretation of this stuff that's key, and that's you guys. So as you're looking at the output, you've got to kind of look at it and say, does that pass a sniff test? Out of order sequence on a sender, I'm not so sure. On a receiver, absolutely. So just be aware of that. And part of this deep dive was all about what do we see here, what do we see there, let's compare them together. And this is an example of where the label might mislead you and why you need to be the tiebreaker. You need to be, I'm going to say it, you need to be the adult in the room, right? And the only reason I say that is when my kids were teenagers and they were driving me crazy, my wife of 37 years, who I love adoringly, she said, John, you have to be the adult in the room. It's like, no, I don't want to be the adult in the room. But yeah, so you guys have to be the adult in the room when it comes to interpreting not just this, but any kind of expert system, expert analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning. These are all prevalent terminologies that we're not going to escape. It's coming. But we have to interpret the data. All right, any comments, discussion about what we just looked at for out-of-sequence packets?
So you must have got married around about 1981.
83.
83.
Yeah. Or wait a minute, that's not right. 82? I'll meet you halfway.
Okay, 82.
Yeah. Yeah, they were good years. I mean, they've all been good years. Okay, so that was a little visit to out-of-sequence packets because I noticed it and I thought it was strange. And I wanted to make sure I called it out for this audience because we're deep diving into stuff and I don't want you to miss it. Back to bytes in flight. Okay, here's a little bit of a surprise. We're now in the receiver, the client, and look, bytes in flight got as high as 20K. It's like, well, wait a minute, don't I ACK every other packet? I'm supposed to. How did it get this high? Well, this is weird. So let's look at how we calculate, let's look at some examples of calculating bytes in flight when there is packet loss or out-of-sequence packets. So notice here, we're in the same ballpark I think that we've been in the past. So notice here we have 2 segments arriving back to back. For one of them, we increment bytes in flight. Makes sense, right? The other one we don't. Now, why don't we? Well, maybe it has something to do with previous segment is not in the capture, and therefore, maybe we don't know really how much is in flight because we know something is missing. I'm speculating wildly here. All I know for sure is there's no number there. It's like, why isn't there a number? I received something, something's in flight, but we didn't increment it. Then, let's see.
Client side?
This is the client side.
Well, bytes in flight for the client would only be data that the client sends to the server, not the other way around, right?
Well, what we saw earlier is as data's coming into the receiver, we were incrementing bytes in flight. We got 2 segments, bytes in flight went up, we ACKed those 2 segments, it went back to 0. Next 2 segments came in, that was, it was about 15 slides ago. Yeah, I think. I'm pretty pleased, Lord. At least I saw them. So, yeah, so we are seeing the receiver, we're accounting for the fact that things are arriving. Now, it sounds strange because bytes in flight is stuff that's being transmitted, but think of this as, there's some terminology in the help manual called forward direction. So bytes are moving from the server to the client. We count bytes in flight at the server. We're also counting them here on the client as well, because you see it right there.
But I think, how is it possible for the client to know outstanding packets from the server?
Yeah, but
Well-
the stack hasn't seen those bytes as yet. We're capturing before the stack.
As long as they're in the batch,
They're still in flight
Yes.
to be received.
Yes, correct.
But when I receive a packet that I haven't acknowledged yet, before I send
And
it
you can see that in the info field if you look at the source and destination.
If we expanded this out, you mean? Or over here?
The source and destination port numbers indicate that this is data coming from the
Server.
server to the client.
Yeah. So this is a good discussion because in my experience, oftentimes I think I get a concept and then I see something that lets me know I didn't really get the concept, and then I dig deeper and then I get a stronger concept. So it's good to have these discussions about, but I thought it did this and I thought it did that. So it does show up on the receiver because it hasn't been acknowledged yet. Like if you freeze time, let's say all you know is packet 1274. You don't know anything else. So bytes came in, they haven't been acknowledged. Next packet, and here's where things get hard for me. Next packet is more data, but we don't increment bytes in flight. Probably because of this, previous segment is missing. So that's what I wanted to call out in this slide. That as you look at, and this is sorted by time. So let's see what we got going on here. Next sequence. We're expecting 658. When we finally got, so here we're saying we're expecting 658. It shows up down here. It was just simply out of order. It wasn't lost. It was truly out of order. When 658 shows up, then we do increment here, and then the math gets straight again. So here's an example where you've got to look at it with almost 2 pair of glasses. If you've heard the expression, my glasses need glasses, this is one of those. So BIF did not increment for 1275. If we look at the two captures together, side by side, kind of that global view where we see what's happening on both sides, you would think. And we orient ourselves at this sequence number, 782 and 782. And so let's assume now we're kind of locked. We're synchronized, right? We're seeing the same segment showing up. What we can't really do a good comparison side by side because things are so different between these two captures. For example, on the server side, we believe we sent 3876. On the client side, we said, well, I received 1292, so that doesn't line up. On the server side, we said, well, I've got 13K in flight. On the client side, I got 1K in flight at this point, because I just received it. I'm about to ACK, in the client, I'm about to ACK 735366. I'm pointing with the wrong finger. But what was the next packet in the server was an ACK for 726077, because they're so far apart. So part of my point in this slide is that if you try to compare by lining up captures packet by packet, it's almost impossible. You have to have a way of visualizing it. So we tried to compare. We're trying to figure out BIF. It's very confusing. We looked at the length field, the ACK field, the BIF, the packet order differences. We try to compare, but it's hard. I mean, it's head exploding hard if you're really trying to figure this stuff out. So this is where visualization really, really helps. So we looked at how we count bytes in flight, and sometimes we don't. It depends on if there's errors or not. The challenge of side by side. Now let's look at visualizing. But before we go there, imagine if you could take both captures and merge them together. Not like merge cap, because merge cap will do that. Right? If anybody familiar with merge cap, edit cap, T-Shark, all fantastic utilities, info caps. But what if you merge them in such a way that you could actually retain what's happening on both sides of the connection? If there was like a high fidelity merge where you can actually fine tune and get precision, like microsecond precision on send time and receive time, you could explicitly identify drops, you could accurately measure congestion and service response time, and include your accuracy of advanced analytics if you merge these things together. So if you merge things together, it melds the split brain. Anybody watch Star Trek? Come on, I know people have to watch the original Star Trek with the a couple more years and people go, what's that? Star Trek. Where's Captain, what's the other guy? Picard. Where's Captain Picard? All right, so the original. And then last year we had a lot of political drama in the States, so I found this and I thought it was funny. So you know that's President Trump and that's Robert Mueller, the special investigator. They're having a go at it. All right, so here's our visualization with a few enhancements. So we've still got packets over time. We still see things. We still see packets bouncing, boom, 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 between the different servers. But we've overlaid a statistical chart here of this tool happens to call it in-flight data, but it's the same thing, bytes in flight. In-flight data, bytes in flight. And the red represents server to the client. The blue represents the client to the server. So you can see we're looking at a period of time where we're only server is sending to the client. So this is a merged capture. It's not something you could load into Wireshark. It wouldn't make any sense. The two PCAPs have come together and they've been merged together for this view. I talked about bytes in flight. We can see specifically now that, hey, frame 998 was actually dropped. For sure it was dropped because it's in one capture and not the other. Not the frame number, but the sequence number, because the frame numbers are different. And then we can see for sure, yeah, there was a retransmission here. And I want to talk some more about what's happening up here. So what is this? So everything we've been talking about bytes in flight is now represented in that top chart. So what does that upward trend tell you about bytes in flight? What does it tell us about the congestion window? It's opening, it's getting bigger. We're able to pump more data. So every few exchanges, we put a little bit more on the wire. It's going up. So you can see bytes in flight, it's like at 15, I don't know, 13K, 14K, 15.5, 16, 70, whatever, maybe up to 18. Why would it drop to 0? So now it's at 0. Why would it drop to 0? And notice that there's, I should have put a line there. There's really a straight line going, I'm going to say going up. From this ACK here, it's a straight line going all the way up. So that 0 is time aligned with the receipt of this ACK at the server. Okay, so question is, why would bytes in flight go to 0?
Retransmit?
The lost packet.
Lost packets, retransmit. Chris, what did you say?
Same thing, packet loss.
Because the congestion window went to 0, right? The throttling mechanism, 8 minutes. The throttling mechanism in the sender has said, don't send any more data because there's too much outstanding. Stop sending data.
Didn't the same thing happen when you had the packet that was, when the server finally received the third duplicate ACK?
Yeah.
This
is a different view of that. It's exactly that. It's the same part area. I think it's the same area. It's the same behavior. It's the exact same behavior.
Yeah, but wasn't the explanation that time that it was because it had to retransmit and then it shut it down and started bothering it?
So let's reverse those two. I'm shutting down the congestion window because the network is not reliable. Mm-hmm. I will retransmit the missing segment, and if it gets there, I might start to get a little more.
Okay, so we're basically saying the same thing in different words.
In the sequencing, yeah, and it's a trust issue. The TCP stack has to trust the network can handle it, and when the network starts to drop packets, where there's indications of packet loss, it's going to not trust it, it's going to shrink it. And we're going to look at the next slide here. So we've got two limits being shown on that chart. The highest limit, which is here, right? And then what happened after the congestion window shut, and we had to stop sending. And maybe shut's not the right terminology. But notice that I've got a peak. If I use the word high watermark, is that a good term? Like the peak that I hit was 18K. After I retransmit, the most I can do is 9K. That's an example of I said to 0. I probably shouldn't have said that. This is an example of it being cut in half. Because I think if we read the spec, I think TCP says if I don't trust the network, I've got to cut the congestion window in half. And this is an example of that, visually. So I did say 0, my bad. So 18K down to 9K. So I stopped transmit. I think there's more details in the next coming slide. So this is, you can chart bytes in flight in Wireshark, but you don't quite get the same perspective. But it is there, and I need to play some more with it. I think I talked to Sake and got some help with trying to do this chart, but there's more needed here for it to be really useful, or more useful. So a closer look at timing. So we're zooming in now to a tighter time period. And the question is, there was a packet dropped here in this packet train. One of these packets was dropped. The question is, when does the server learn about it? How can we see that visually? When does the server hear the news? By the way, I don't know if you guys work on routers and you have random early detection drops and weighted random early detection. Does anybody work on QoS, so that terminology is familiar, right? So maybe this was just visually where it is in the picture, maybe it was a tail drop. It's been a long time since I looked at that stuff, I just know it exists, I don't remember the details. But it could be that there's a queuing issue that said I'm going to drop something because I don't have enough capacity. Anyway, so 2 of the dupbacks occur in this exchange here, right? Because the actual drop was kind of late. 2 of the duplicate acts are in here, haven't yet learned about the 3rd duplicate act. The server has not yet learned. So what is it doing? It's putting more segments on the wire to try to keep the congestion window full. And then finally in this burst here is when we learn of the triple duplicate act. And if you notice, and this, did I zoom in on this? No, I didn't. Okay. So if you notice, it's a little hard to see, but if I steady my hand, one of the acts came in and 1 packet went out, and that was the missing packet. So we stopped there. So there's our 3rd of 3 duplicate acts. And then look at the cost. So what is the cost of that 1 packet dropping? What is the cost in round trip time, elapsed time? Sorry? 3 round trips. Yeah, exactly. So we've lost almost 400 milliseconds because 1 packet was lost. And it's kind of a function of the latency. So this customer who's in Phoenix and Hong Kong, I mean, they're suffering terribly because there's a lot more latency than, what I was dealing with here. Phoenix to Hong Kong is like, 200, 250, something like that. So anytime you have packet loss, it's a major drama. And what I learned, availability, my ISP can't give me bandwidth because they don't have any more. We're constantly dealing with those trade-offs, doing the jobs that we do. So that was one of their trade-offs. All right. 3 round trips discussion, because we've only got 2 minutes left. So,
can we just revisit the bytes in flight for a quick second?
Okay.
Because if I understood correctly, you have, I've always been thinking about bytes in flight as unacknowledged data as the sender sees it.
Okay.
However, if I'm not mistaken, now you actually also have bytes in flight in the time between receiving a packet and actually acknowledging it.
Yes.
That little split, tiny little fraction of a second.
Tiny.
So you're actually looking at, in a server-client communication, you're actually looking at 4 kinds of bytes in flight. The servers send bytes in flight and receive bytes in flight. And
Could be,
also the
yep.
clients.
Yep, exactly. If there's payload going back, so if you can imagine one of those really weird, interesting SMB type connections where it's one connection and things are going in both directions at the same time, it's like, wow, how do you keep track of that? I mean, that'll make your head
Now I
explode.
understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments? Because I think we're about to wrap.
That bytes in flight on the client side could also be a result of the client not being able to, upload the data quick enough, so he's falling behind in acknowledgement?
Well, so that's a great question. I have seen cases where the receiving machine is so CPU saturated, we can see packets coming in, but they're not getting acknowledged. And in that case, those bytes in flight would go up. Because there wasn't enough CPU available for the TCP stack to do its job. Yeah. So it couldn't actually, now somehow PCAP was able to capture those packets even when the environment is CPU overloaded. But the key is, like we were just talking about, it'll count towards bytes in flight until we see the ACK. Because put yourself in Wireshark's shoes. It just sees bytes going back and forth. It doesn't really know the term client, server, resender. It knows who's sending, who's receiving. But it doesn't know where the capture was taken. Maybe it was taken in the middle of the network. right? So back to your point earlier about taps and spans, right? If we took a capture from the middle of the network, let's say Chicago, in my case, it would be in the middle, we would see bytes in flight show up as the packets pass through Chicago, we would capture them, and then there'd be a bytes in flight until an acknowledgement comes back. So there'd be bytes in flights for half of the round trip time, assuming Chicago's in the middle. So Wireshark's calculations are kind of, they're just, how do I want to say this? There's no other information available. Who's the client, who's the server, how far away, it's only what we can see. So I need to skip through some stuff here. Quickly, what does that pattern suggest of bytes in flight? What we did is we said, okay, let's drill into the transfer. If you remember way back when we started this, there was a 1.6 meg transfer that took 16 seconds. That's the area in the capture visualized where the transfer is taking place. If we zoom into that block, 1.4 meg, this pattern of bytes in flight, what does that suggest to you visually?
Time loss.
Say it again.
Packet loss.
Yes, and?
It happens every time you get to a certain level.
And? That's right. And? What's the TCP effect that we're looking at? Congestion window closing, and if it ever gets down to 0, we're looking at slow start. Right? Because slow start means we're going to go back all the way to 0, and we're going to test the net one segment at a time and make sure that. So we only hit 0 a couple times. Sort of here maybe, but then we went down and we went back up. So you can see the congestion window doing all kinds of flapping because the network is so bad between my house and San Francisco. In terms of advanced analytics, when we merge things together, this is a summary view of the total time, 16 seconds, of the total time, where was the delay? And purple means protocol delay. So having to do with TCP timers and delays and things happening in the protocol, the majority of my time was spent in protocol delay, a little bit of bandwidth in green, and blue means congestion. So there was congestion in the path, meaning latency plus queuing delay while I'm waiting for congested links. So honestly, if I could just do that, I wouldn't, and if it was right and I trusted it, I probably wouldn't spend a lot of time with decodes because there's my answer. It's protocol delay and there's packet loss. So, but this course is about looking at the details with Wireshark, comparing client to server, and we talked about these things: segmentation offload, packet loss. There's our comparison update. Now you guys have seen this movie, right? Yes? No? Star Wars? Oh, come on. We finished the 6th leg. We're done with our marathon. We should be celebrating. Hooray. I hope this was interesting. TCP can be confusing, especially when there's latency. You take the latency out, things get simpler. As soon as you inject latency, now things are happening on different ends, independently, but yet somehow related. It's an odd concept. They make their own decisions, but they do influence each other in terms of the TCP stack behavior. So it's useful if you can get captures from both endpoints. I live my life with my brain split. So welcome to my world. And to really understand it, you got to be thinking about, okay, I'm looking at the client, what might be happening over there, why am I seeing this? Oh, of course, it's because, and then your knowledge of Wireshark and TCP kick in. So obviously there's a ton of great Wireshark features, the views, the profiles, the sorting. It's just absolutely wonderful. But it can only take you so far when you've got a certain level of complexity, and this is where visualization helps. So we looked at those things, but then we looked at these things. This Excel spreadsheet will be uploaded. As I mentioned, it's got the details of what we reviewed. Any final questions or comments?
So if
If we look at our initial round trip time and we say, okay, as you suggested, we're somewhere in the middle,
Yeah.
is there anything useful we can get from Bytes in Flight?
Totally, because if you're troubleshooting a slow transfer and Bytes in Flight never gets as high as the potential, there's something called bandwidth delay product, which is the potential for a given link speed and a given latency. The bandwidth delay product tells you what the optimal receive window size is, which would ultimately influence the congestion window. If you're not getting close to bandwidth delay product, your Bytes in Flight, then you've got to figure out why it's not really moving ahead. It's either, congestion, drops, could be send buffers like we talked about here.
But if our capture point was very close to the recipient,
Yes.
you see our Bytes in Flight will never go particularly high, can we still get anything useful?
Not if you're on top of the client,
Okay.
right? Because there's limits to what you can see. It's really from the sender's perspective. Now, going back to SMB, where you've got two asynchronously sending back and forth, then ideally you'll get both. If you can, you'll get both captures. And of course, Wireshark, it's free. You can do the captures. I think now we have to have NPCap, which is bundled in as well. So it's not like there's cost involved. It's really just time and permissions. Will the security team let me put Wireshark on so I can grab a capture? And in some cases, the skill level of the people at the desktop, if it's a remote branch, that has challenges. But the goal would be, as much as you can, get both. And then if you can get one or the other, be aware of what you can focus on and what you can't focus on. Yes, sir.
You said something that SSL VPN was used. Did you also check if there was actually package loss on the SSL VPN, or did you just look into the traffic within the VPN?
So this capture for the client was on the pseudo interface on the VPN on my laptop. So it came from inside the tunnel. If I were to look at my Wi-Fi adapter and capture on that, it wouldn't really have told me much because it's just tunnels. There would have been packet loss in tunnels, but I had a ton of stuff open. I had Pandora running, I had Outlook running. So this capture was heavily filtered to just this section. Yeah, but it's a great point. Yeah. And Angela was giving me the nod. All right, you guys. Well, thank you. Appreciate your time and attention.